When I've live yet. There we go.
Live. Oh, I need to mute the other screen though.
Laura's the only one not holding the book.
Oh, sorry. Hello, guys.
It's fantasy fiction formula time. I don't have the chat up, so hello everybody.
I totally do.
So, welcome to this month's
got a letter.
craft. I couldn't even remember the words. Book club. We're talking about the fantasy fiction formula today. But I want to say some hellos to everyone first. Hi, Alexa.
No, Laura, remember, you're just jumping right in.
Hey, Kristen. Hi, Ruth. Hi, everybody. Hey, Kim.
Just say hello, everyone, because the chat's taking forever to load. So
yeah, Devin, Megan, what's up? Another Megan, hello. Hello.
Hello, everybody.
I wish better days were here, Zellers. Hi, Brianna.
I still can't get my chat to load, so...
Hello.
Hi. You're all beautiful, and I love you very much.
How's everyone's Sunday going? Hopefully better than mine. I just woke up on the wrong side of the bed today. I don't know.
You're supposed to go back to the bed and then roll.
Right?
So here in California today, it is humid AF. It is like 70% humidity, which is insane for here. It's like 70 degrees. So we opened up the sliding glass door and I was like, oh no, I shut it.
Yeah, it's pretty warm here too. Hi, Beatrix. I let the dogs out and I was sitting there. I was like, ew, starting to sweat.
The thing is it's not warm here. Well, at least in Anaheim, like it's like 70 degrees, which is pretty nice. But then the humidity is nuts. It's going to be like in the hundreds again this weekend though, next weekend. So.
Hi, Chris. Oh, donuts. That sounds nice.
Donuts fix everything.
I started back on Weight Watchers today, guys. No donuts for me.
You started today?
I did. I started back today.
I'm starting Tuesday.
I'm starting tomorrow.
So yeah, I went ahead. I was like, look, I just need to just do it. Let's just do it. So I started today.
I had a few more things in my house that I needed to get out of my house before I started. So I was like, I'll just eat like all of my junk food this week. And this is completely backwards. But
that's what I've done in the past for sure. It's
not really junk food. It's just not great points.
Well, I figured that like if you eat all the bad stuff the day before your first weigh-in, then it looks like you're also higher up because you're bloated. And it looks like you lost more weight the first week.
Yeah, exactly.
First week is great.
Yeah.
Hi, Carolyn. Hi, Ashley. Hi, Hudson.
Hello, everybody. I'm going back tomorrow.
Yeah, it works for me when I can stay on it. So fingers crossed, I've lost on like 100 pounds on it before. And then I got really depressed again and put it all back on. So
been there, sister.
Here I am, round 512.
Been there before. We have our group chat. We can hold each other accountable.
Oh yeah, we should.
Right, we can.
I was gonna say, I just need you to mess me every day. Put the donut down, you fat. I almost said I almost B word.
Hi, Shay.
Drop the donut.
I also got a recumbent bike, so hoping that
I have one and it's nice, but here's my warning.
Exercise.
Here's my warning. Those things make your butt go numb so easily. So we're actually considering getting an extra padding.
Yeah.
And I feel like the internet's listening because I was talking to Damien about how uncomfortable the seat is, and now I keep getting those ads for the purple mattresses. Make a purple seat now. It's a cushion for other seats. And I was like, they're listening, but I want one.
But so, you're interested, so.
I am, because those things make your butt go so numb.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone. I think a lot of people sometimes wait to hear what we think, and that's cool, baby. I don't mind being a guinea pig.
That's what I normally do.
Yeah. And I, for one, have some mixed thoughts on this one. So I'm definitely curious, for those of you in the chat especially that read it, we are curious what you guys thought.
Yes.
Because I'll just sort of say generally, like I have mixed. Like I think there were some things in there I liked and some things I have some things to say about. So I'm curious. I think some of you, I don't know if any of you who had messaged me about this book are in the chat, but some of you recommended it to me. So I'm curious if any of you that did that or had already read it, what you like about it or what works for you. I also don't write fantasy, though we can talk about that element of the book as well, and how well it addresses writing fantasy.
Can I just say like a really weird tiny thing that like I thought was just strange about the book is that sometimes when she was writing, like when she'd use her own books as an example, she would write about it in third person, like this book by Deborah Chester, and then sometimes sometimes she would say my book. So I thought that was a little strange. Like pick one or the other. It was a little weird.
I think it was the ones that were under her real name. She said by my book, and the ones that were under her pen names were by so and so. But then she tells you what her pen names are, so that makes zero sense.
I didn't catch that.
I was just like, okay, that's a little weird quirk you got going there.
Okay, so Ashley didn't get all the way through, but what she read was working for her. Ruth, what did you think of it when you read it back then? Like, especially those of you who write fantasy. I'm also curious for those of you who read it, if you've read a lot of other craft books, because I feel like depending on how many other craft books you read may influence how much you like this one. Especially if I feel like this is a little bit more geared towards people who haven't read a lot of craft.
Your book, the amount of flags you have in your book.
Yeah.
I don't do flags.
Well, I do a lot of them because not only do I do this chat, but then I also like review the book for my channel, like an overall review after I've had time to think about the chat, because I like to hear everyone's perspective before I review it. So these are just things like for me to find, like to know that these were important things I wanted to like bring up maybe in my review or something.
Jessica, did you use paper clips?
They are these little arrows.
Oh, cute.
Oh, those are cute.
I got them out of the Owlcrate box last month, and I was like, I'm gonna love this book, so I'm gonna use these really cool paper clips. And that is not the case. So.
Oh man. Okay.
Yeah, I think
I just tabbed things that I thought might be useful for me in the future that I would like to go back to, because so much of it was shit that I learned in kindergarten that I just tabbed the things that I thought I might want to go back and read later, and then my red flags for things that are red flags.
Carolyn said that she read it a couple of years ago. What did you think of it when you read it, Carolyn? And I think, Kristen, you're right that I want to kind of talk about for sure how much of it we felt like was helpful towards fantasy writing in particular. As someone who doesn't write fantasy, I can only speak a little bit to it, but I do have an interest in writing fantasy, specifically more like urban fantasy, but yeah.
There were just things that she said that
So Ruth liked it, but hasn't done the exercises yet. I didn't look at all of the exercises. I knew I wasn't going to do them right now. But I will say that the few I saw, I was kind of like...
I read them, but I didn't do them.
Here's what I thought about this book as a whole. I feel like Deborah Chester wanted to write a memoir, but no one would pay her to write a memoir. So she decided to then put in like some book facts so that she could sell it as a craft book. Because every chapter starts out with, this one time when me and my sister were little kids, we did X, Y, Z. And like she uses her own, I mean, I guess I understand like she uses her own life experience to explain things.
Yeah.
But, like, I don't give two shits about you and your sister when you were 7 years old. Like,
okay, like I 100% agree. I don't, not necessarily different things, but in her defense, a lot of authors do that. Stephen King's
his book is more of a memoir to me.
That's what I'm saying. And also, the one that we're going to read for next month, I won't say yet, but is also a little more like on the personal side. So I know like Francesca Leah Block has written a craft book where she uses like her life. It's sort of like a memoir. So I think that there is a precedent for that in craft books to sort of like weave in your life to your...
I don't need it.
I don't want that.
I would agree. It's not really my bag either.
I want it.
She actually has 2 other craft books. So,
wait, what'd you say?
She has 2 other craft books. I believe they're both writing exercise books. That's all exclusively what they are.
Interesting.
So
I haven't read that book by Francesca yet, but I really want to. She was working on it when we took that class with her.
Here's what I'll say: if you like the things at the end of the chapters, the exercises, to check out her other books if you do like them.
Yeah. So let's just start out. So we got kind of mixed thoughts on it. So let's kind of start out with talking about it in terms of fantasy fiction formula. So I personally, and I think you guys probably, sounds like you guys agree, I don't know how much I think this was helpful if you're looking for advice on how to write things that are specific to fantasy writing. I think she's calling it a fantasy craft book because all of her examples are from fantasy. So like she's taking general writing advice and applying it to fantasy examples.
I think that probably is helpful to some people.
Especially if you haven't read a lot of other craft books.
Yeah.
Then 100%, this is like on a 101 level, I would feel like.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that like I actually think that can be helpful, like taking, if you don't know a lot about fantasy or writing or like them applying it specifically to fantasy examples, I think can be helpful. But I agree that like I don't know if a lot of this was specific to like at one part she's like, oh, learn about, if you're writing about sword fights, which I have something to say about that later. If you learn about sword fights, research sword fights. You can say that about anything in fiction. Like if you're writing about hacking computers, learn about hacking computers. So like I do feel like a lot of it was more 101.
Here's what I'll say in defense of like her kind of using the fantasy slant is I know that when I read Writing Deep Scenes, it was extremely helpful to me to see the ideas applied to a YA contemporary, because that's what I'm writing. So sometimes it's hard for me to understand how to apply those to what I'm writing if they're talking about a different genre. So I think that if you write fantasy, especially if you write fantasy exclusively, and you're still kind of getting into the fundamentals of just writing craft period, then I do think that this could be helpful for that, because she's using only fantasy as examples. And I do think that some of the general writing advice applies more to fantasy than, say, a YA contemporary. I was like, I don't really know if this would work in a contemporary, like some of the advice that she gave.
I actually agree with what Phoebe just said, that I'm not sure the fantasy she uses is the kind of fantasy that gets published now. I agree. So a lot of the examples she used are old books that like from like 20, 30 years ago. And I feel like fantasy is very different now than it was.
Because this was published in 2016.
But she's still using, it's kind of like Alexa said for one of the old books we used. Oh, about the thrillers. She's using old examples that, I mean, besides like Harry Potter, she's using a lot of, I know you have something to say about that, but
even that was 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of like the high fantasy examples she uses are old. She's not using any new ones, like any of the popular new ones that are coming out.
And I think they do that so that they're not like spoiling things for people. But you could use like the most popular fantasy books of the day. You could use like some Sarah J. Maas, some Leigh Bardugo, something like that that's fantasy that 90% of your audience has read before.
I have a feeling she would not use any YA examples if any were given to her. She would not. She just doesn't seem like the type. She doesn't seem like the type that would be like, I'm going to put YA examples. Like,
okay, well, I read YA fantasy, not adult fantasy, so I have no example off the top of my head.
I was thinking like Brandon Sanderson, right? I mean,
yeah.
But if you want advice about how Brandon Sanderson writes books,
you can
Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah, you can watch him. I really want to.
Yeah, I think that this has been a theme in all of the craft books that we've read, is the examples they choose are so strange and often like affect the effectiveness of the text.
Yeah. I think that's why I liked Save the Cat Writes a Novel so much, is that like the examples were relevant.
Yes, I agree.
They're relevant to books coming out recent in the last 6 years.
I had some issues with Writing Deep Scenes examples, but there were some good ones in there that really were helpful for me. And again, that some of that is just subjective, like what is helpful for one person may not be helpful for, so it's kind of hard. Like
I just feel like though, like if you're gonna have examples of like, this is like a good example of, you know, doing this correctly, but it's like that kind of writing in fantasy is not done anymore. So like at that point it doesn't become, you're steering them towards an old fantasy writing way.
Yeah, I also just, since we're talking about the examples, I just want to complain for like a hot second that it was just so much Harry Potter. Like just so much Harry Potter.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I get it. Like everyone knows Harry Potter, but like also like I don't know. It just felt like, okay, I'm tired of hearing about Harry Potter. I'm tired of thinking about Harry Potter.
But as
Harry Potter.
We talked about this, and I think that the reason why is because it is so popular.
I get it. Like, I get it. But like on a personal level, like I'm over it. I'm over Harry Potter. Can we please?
And also, it was also 20 years ago. I was 12 or 13 when that series came out. It's been 20 years. Let's move on.
I want to say my nitpicky thing about Harry Potter is the part where she talks about like levels of importance of characters, and she said Hermione's not as important as Ron.
Yeah.
I didn't agree with that. I was like, Hermione does everything in those books. How is she lower than Ron on levels of importance? It made me feel like she's never read or watched any of them, because Hermione is just as important as Ron, if not more, because she does everything in those books. But,
well, and not only that, but at some point, originally Ron was going to be written out of the book series and going to be killed off. Therefore, how important could he really have been if he wasn't going to make it through to the
end? You really think about it? Like, he doesn't do as much as he's
a lump on a log.
She just like on a base level does way more than he does.
They would have died in book 1 if it wasn't for her.
Yeah. There was something else. I'm trying to look at my notes. There was something else about hierarchies that I was questioning as well. Like
I'm trying to remember where it was at, because this is probably.
She said something about like the hierarchy of like subplots, and I was just like, I don't know if I agree with that either. I don't remember what it was though. I just remember I was just questioning like some of the ways she was ranking some things that I was just like, I don't know about that.
Hilla said that she hates how it was very much shut up and do what I tell you to do. My way's the only way.
Okay, so that is also a theme of almost all the craft books we have read. Almost all of them have a very clear sense of voice where they're like, yo, I know what I'm talking about. You would be dumb if you don't listen to me. Rather than just being like, hey, here's something you could try. I feel like a lot of them are really prescriptive, and which is kind of like the opposite of what we tend to do here on AuthorTube, which is we try not to do stuff like that. But that's also one of the really authorities, and I think that they're really taking on the authoritative voice in these. I personally didn't like her tone. That was just a personal, but I tend to not like a lot of their tones in the book. So
I kind of got lost in where she was talking about structure of voice and deciding who's talking and explaining that if you have more than one person, like every time a new person talks, you should have a new paragraph. And I'm like, yeah, I learned that in 2nd grade. Can we?
Yeah. There were certain things so one of the things that I wrote with that, I even put like, okay, this is all 101, is the action reaction section. I was like, this is stuff that is like taught in like basic writing, like very, very basic writing. Like when there's an action, there's a reaction. It's like, yeah, that's how stories
If you are in middle school or high school, this book is probably great for you.
I feel like Laura disagrees with what I just said because of the face she's making.
I don't necessarily disagree. That was one of the things that I felt like I have it under my tab of like could be helpful from the book. Not that you don't know that every action should have a reaction, but I felt like she was really wanting you to be conscious of marking where an action is in the scene and where the immediate reaction happens. Because I do read sometimes stories where something happens and it seems like no one was paying attention to the thing that happened. And it's like, yo, you don't have a reaction to that. Like, you don't, like, there's not something, like, people are just existing in a vacuum. So I felt like her trying to sort of say it as, like, pairings, like, mark the reaction. Don't let them be too far apart. Like, I felt like this is sort of generally what the book was. It was just her tips. I didn't feel like it was a process book. It was like someone gave her a topic and then she rattled off some tips about it. And then the next topic, and she rattled off some tips about it, right? Like from her experience, as opposed to like a craft process book. So I found some of her tips helpful, but as a whole, I don't know that I found it a helpful craft process book.
Here's what I guess I'll say is that nowhere did we expect this to be over a 101. It was more of like 101 in fantasy. So I will give her some slack that like I wasn't expecting this to be like a 400 level.
Sure.
Like, so I'm not saying there's anything against it being a 101. It just felt 101, if that makes sense. Like I'm not
felt like you shouldn't have to say this.
Yeah, but again, if it is 101, then that's fine. I'm not saying it's not 101. So like,
yeah. Well, I was thinking about this in terms of fantasy and like it being called a fantasy craft book because I was thinking, okay, I don't feel like it talked enough about how to write fantasy in particular. So then I had to ask myself, well, then what would that look like, right? What would I have expected? So I started thinking about it and I was like, okay, well, like for example, her section on magic is like a half a page.
Yeah.
Right? So I just felt like, or like world building, like she has like special world section. It's not even a full page. So I just felt like those to me are the two things that intimidate me the most about writing fantasy. Is world building, magic systems, making things make sense, making them interesting. And so I didn't feel like there was a process being developed or explained. Like she was just kind of again giving tips, like make sure your magic doesn't do this, and make sure you have this. Like
I think she had good tips where she's like it fantasy doesn't have to be illogical. Consider its source. Like again, they were good tips, but it didn't make me think. I mean, it made me think like, okay, make sure you have a source for your magic. Make sure it makes sense to an extent, right? Because magic, but it didn't go into depth of like, yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, it was very much like. The things that she had on world building and magic were interesting, but also like if this is a fantasy related book, we're gonna need some things a little more stretched out than that.
And how do people develop them? How do we come up with a world building? How do we come up with magic systems? Like that's kind of what I was looking for when I think about like craft and advice. Like how do you like some people are saying in the chat, like they should have had whole chapters devoted to these sections if you're talking about writing fantasy in particular.
And I think it's because I liked her tips on fantasy and on world building and magic. It makes me wish more that she had gone into depth because I did like the tips she gave. Like I think they were good tips. Because of that, I wish she had gone more in depth in how to like flesh these out. But yeah, like if it's supposed to be about fantasy, there was definitely a lacking, at least on world building. I mean,
she could have took out like 4 or 5 stories about her and her little sister and put in some magic. I mean,
Patty.
Yeah, I also just didn't like the organization. Like it was, like I said, that's what made it come off more of just like a whole book of tips. Because it was like I felt like the headers were a topic, and then she just rattled off tips about it. So someone's like, "Okay, talk about." Viewpoints, and she's like, okay, well, viewpoints, make sure you don't do this, make sure you do that, like it didn't feel like other craft books where you felt like someone is trying to teach you like a process and walk you through steps of getting to a certain place or writing in a certain kind of way. It was really just like it felt like I think you're right, Jessica, the more I think about it, that it felt very memoir-y, where it was just pulled from her experience, like as if she was like your mentor, like if you were her student and she was just like, okay, make sure you don't do this. Don't forget this. Lots of people make this mistake. Don't make it. And I also didn't feel like that needed to be like 300 pages.
Well, and I think it's interesting how she had less than 3 pages about world building and magic, but had 3 chapters about having a soggy middle. And the middle of this book was a slog. It was the worst part. Like, you're trying to tell me how not to have a soggy middle of a book, but your craft book is a soggy middle.
Agreed. She also has a very long chapter on revision that I felt very convoluted.
I did mark the revision, like the revision phases.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was interesting, and like I may employ that in the future as like a experiment to see how I feel like that revision process actually works with the book. So I did mark that, but it didn't need to be like 60 some pages of.
I just think it's weird that was longer than the section on magic.
Right.
Like why are you going to do a 15-page chapter on revision? Very convoluted, long process of revision, but then you're just gonna be like, oh, in magic, make sure it makes sense. And it costs something. Like I felt like that was the only thing.
I mean, what's weird is that for how long this book was, like as I was reading it, I was like, oh, this, I was like, this is a quick read. But then I felt like it took forever at the same time. I don't know how to explain it because like I felt like I was going through it quickly, but then it was a quick that never ended.
Yeah. Also, I promise I am going to talk in just a little bit about some things I did find helpful. So these are more just kind of general. And then I want to talk about some specifics that I did think were like some of the better parts. But there was something I do kind of want to address. And I don't know if you guys picked up on it or if anyone else did, that I just felt uncomfortable with. Is she said a couple of problematic things in here that I
marked one, but I gotta find it.
And so I had let's say I marked. Okay, so she said that she makes lesser beings speak ungrammatical with rougher language. Didn't really care for that, especially as a former teacher. Like I always emphasize that there is no hierarchy of language, right? Like there's appropriate for time and place, but like to say that lesser beings speak ungrammatical is really problematic for me. I didn't care for that. She also used the word ghetto in the book that I didn't really care for in the context that she was using it.
I missed that, but to be fair, I was skimming most of them.
It was toward the end where I'm sure you probably started skimming. She also gives an examples of like how to make your character sympathetic or like victims, and she kind of talks about how liking one kind of victim better than another, like the victim needs to have a certain kind of affect for someone to sympathize with them.
Yeah.
And she's like, if you have this fire victim and this fire victim, and this one's not saying or doing anything, just sitting there, and this one's crying and whining and blah, 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 we're going to care more about the crying, whining one. We're going to like her better. And I was like, ew.
No, because people deal with stressful situations.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about trauma. I just found that so kind of gross. I don't know. I understand what she was. I'm not even gonna say I understand. I didn't like it. So, and there was just, hold on, one other thing, and then we could kind of unpack these. But there was also sort of an ableist comment that she said toward the end, where she said, there are people who get things done and there are people who have excuses.
I wrote there, I said, but girl, what if I have depression? I wrote that in the book.
Yeah. So
what if I have depression though?
I was like,
say that there's either people who get things done or people who make excuses. I felt very ableist, very short-sighted, very oversimplified. And I took personal offense to that.
Yeah, that's why I wrote that. I was like, well, okay.
My excuse was I took like time off so I could read this book.
My thing was, okay, so I might have misread it, but there was a point where she's talking about viewpoint where she's like, and then you use pronouns like he, she, or it. And I was like, it is not a pronoun. And she didn't mention they. And I was like, okay. They is a pronoun that people use. So.
Yeah.
There was also a part where she was talking about how to make characters sound different. I think it might have been part of what you talked about, Laura, where she was like, if you need to make someone sound different, add in a stutter. I'm like, really? You just like add in a stutter for a character?
Yeah, I thought that was just bad advice about how she
really
make them sound different. I actually just did not agree.
Kevin, for the rest of this stream, I'm going to need you to stutter so you sound different from me and Laura.
Yeah, some of this stuff I was like, whoa, why is someone doing this right now? Like, it just felt like a big oversight here. It's like, okay, where is the as I like to say, the common sense police here? Like, can we please just have like hire me as a common sense consultant and I will go through your book and be like, no, sweetie, we're not gonna say this because this is dumb.
What Lizelle said is like, and this is why when people are like, there's no racism in my fantasy. And I'm like, is there? Because yeah, that like being like, oh, have them talk ungrammatically. It's ghetto. Like that is racist. Like,
to be fair, she said ghetto in relation to something else, not about talking. But I feel like you really shouldn't be using that word unless you're using it in a very like historical, factual context and not a description of certain kinds of things. Like, I don't know. It was very weird.
Like, my mom's side of the family's from the ghetto.
Like, you shouldn't like say stuff like that, especially not like in a book. Like, I just felt like, really? I don't know. Like
that thing concerns me because she's supposed to be teaching you, and I feel like that's a problematic thing to be teaching people.
Like, I do get to an extent that, like, as writers, we tend to him and ha and be over analytical, and sometimes you just got to do the thing. But to say, like, to kind of create a dichotomy of, like, those who do and those who don't was just oversimplified at the very least, at the very least. So I just didn't really like that. And I just felt like I would be remiss if I didn't at least say publicly, hey, I don't like these things in this book. Yeah. It did not work for me. So
it was, there's some interesting pieces.
But I wouldn't say that was an overall tone of the book. These were just these examples of where I just felt like her own, like, personal language just slipped where she's not thinking about
also, how old is she?
Probably older.
I was thinking the same thing, actually. It's like, maybe she's just, like, older and she does, which is not an excuse. I'm just saying, like,
but that makes
it's not an excuse. Right.
She's probably a middle-aged white woman, and we know how they are.
No, she's definitely white, and at least middle-aged.
So, like,
Yeah, some other people noticed the trauma child section is also weird. So yeah, so I just didn't really like that at all. So, but let's see, what other kind of
Are we talking about things we didn't like? Because I have 2 things marked.
Sure, go for it.
It's a small thing. But one of the things she said, if you want readers to like a character, give that story person an appealing name. If you want readers to dislike or distrust a character, see the examples above. There's nothing subtle about this technique, and there shouldn't be. That is so stupid. Like, evil McEvilson, come on. Yeah. You cannot be subtle about your evil people having evil names and your good people having good names. That, to me, was the most ridiculous advice. It's like, what is this, JR? Like, I'm sorry. That, to me, made no sense. Like, if you want somebody to be good, give them a good-sounding name, and there's no subtlety to that. Like, come on. That is so dumb. I'm sorry. That is just straight-up dumb. I just 100% disagree with that. She's, like, saying, like, give them a name like Professor Snape. What is she even talking about? I completely disagree with that entire section.
Yeah, that is sort of weird. Like,
and she said there's no room for subtlety in this technique.
That reminds me of, like, James N. Frey, where he was just like where he was like, make your villains really bad and not have backstories, and you're just like, what?
Exactly.
I like that anymore. Like,
it felt like a very old-timey way of writing fantasy, where, like, you have, like I said, like, evil McEvilson against godly, like,
Johnny Good.
Yeah, it's just like, it doesn't make any sense. And the fact that she said there's no room for subtlety just really hit home, and I just completely disagree with that. Maybe I'm wrong here, though. Maybe people agree with that, but I just think it sounds weird.
Gwen of Goodness and Cal the Callous. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I just feel like you read James Frey, and you're like, well, then I need to have a super evil villain whose name is Cal the Callous.
Stinky Stinkerson.
Was there something else, Kevin, that you wanted to complain about?
Yes, let me find it. I'm sorry, did you disagree with me on that?
No. I was letting you said you had 2 things, so yeah. I was letting you...
So, I red flagged 2 things, so I'm with you, Kev.
There's, on page 97, she talks about how if you're going to write, like, a certain kind of sword fight with certain kinds of swords, you should know how that's done, and blah, blah, blah. And she goes on and on about how you need to know that, make sure it's accurate, make sure blah, blah. And I wrote down, like, this is supposed to be a fantasy novel. It's not historical fiction. If I was writing historical fiction, then sure, maybe this fight with this kind of sword should be a very specific kind of way. But in a fantasy, people may disagree with me, but I just feel like in fantasy, if I want someone to, she's like, oh, if you're riding on horseback, you don't stab with the sword, you slash with it. I was like, okay, yeah, like in historical context, but like, I feel like in a fantasy, you can have your people do whatever you want. It's a fantasy. It's not historical fiction. I'm not writing historical fiction. So, like, to be so 100% accurate on, like, you can only do this kind of fighting with this kind of sword, and, like, how in movies it makes no sense because blah, blah, blah. I was like, it's fantasy. It's not, like, especially in the movie section where she was talking about, like, I was watching this movie and they did this kind of fight and I knew it was wrong because that's not how you fight with that kind of sword. And I was like, if you're watching a movie, they're not trying to be 100% accurate.
Okay, so I have a question on this because as someone who has literally never written a swords fight scene in my life or anything remotely close. I'm thinking about this in terms of like when they talk about how even though science fiction is speculative, you still have to adhere to the laws of science to some degree. And I'm wondering if that's what she means with the weaponry. Like maybe it's literally not possible to yield that weapon in that way when you're on a horse.
Like no, she was saying that you
impossible.
No, she said that the reason why you slash when you're riding a horse rather than stab is because if you stab and it gets stuck in them, they can ride away with your sword, and then your arm, then you don't have a sword any longer, which I agree with. I'm just saying that like to say that you have to be 100% accurate to the way that things work, it just doesn't like. And she's like complaining about the way it's done in movies. And I was like, I just feel like it's a fantasy. So
at that part of the book, I literally said, what if I can pull a sword back with my magic? Who cares?
What I'm saying is like,
I have a magic glove that I wear that's fuck, you can do that in a sci-fi. Like if you have a specific cool metal that you invented in your glove and it's in the hilt of your sword and you can call your sword back like into your hand. As someone who has written fight scenes with swords
and
then like arrows and weapons, like you can add magic to anything to make it work outside of the normal context of history.
Yeah, I think it needs to make more sense in your world. Like, is this how things work there? Like,
and with what Lizelle said, I actually wrote that she said most people won't really care or know. I wrote that. I said like a normal person that's reading, like me reading fantasy, if someone like wrote how you use a sword wrong, like when I'm reading Game of Thrones or Robin Hobb, like I don't know the certain kind of sword in this scene. I just want it to be a good scene. I'm not one of those. I like history, but not to the point where I'm going to be like, this is the wrong way you fight with that sword. Maybe I think there are different kinds of readers though, so maybe I fall in that camp, but I just feel like most fantasy readers I know, personally at least, won't know the certain kind of fighting you need to do with a certain kind of sword and a certain kind of scene and a certain kind of setting.
I do think it's fair to say, like, if it's historical, well, then yeah, you're trying to be historically accurate. But yeah, like, I guess the assumption also is that most fantasy is like based on like medieval Europe.
Yes, and I agree with that, but I still think like to an extent, like there's a difference between me writing a historical fiction and then me writing a fantasy novel.
Yeah.
Where it's based off of it, but it's not that world. So like not like again, there was no magic in. So like I can take this world, add magic. You know what I mean? Like I don't know. I just disagree with her section there. I agree that there are some people that will people that are really into history that will pick up on the small historical details and realize that. But I just feel like at least the people I know, like the fantasy readers I know would not know that off the top of their head.
Yeah, well, yeah. I don't really pay attention to those things anyway. I also that kind of well we'll come back to that. But yeah, I don't know those things at all. I would never pay attention. I the only thing, like I said, that I can see is that I do know that like with science fiction, like, but even then I feel like you can get around it if you can explain. Like you can make up a science. Like, whoa, we figured out the thing. And so maybe it's like along the lines of that. Like if you're gonna do something, it needs to make sense in your world that you're creating. Right.
Like I would never say like do a sword fight with a dagger. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like,
use a long sword as like fighting stars, you know, you just like
you can't throw a long sword like that. So like
you can.
I mean, you can. It doesn't mean it's gonna do anything.
It's probably not gonna do you any good, but you can.
I understand doing research, and I think that you should do research. I'm just saying, like, I felt like there's a weird pressure behind it to be like, this needs to be 100% accurate, and I think that can then lead some people to be intimidated to even write it because they're like, I need to research every single little bit. And I'm not saying you shouldn't research. I 100% think you should research.
I think that's like a fair sort of comment to like, how much do you need to know about certain things to be able to write them?
But she didn't really go into detail. She just said you need to make sure you're right, and then
that was more for me. Like my issue was like same thing with the magic, same thing with the world building. It's like she's not, for a 101 especially, she's not telling you how to do these things. She's giving you tips after the fact or like ways to apply it to what you did, but she's not trying to help you get there, like how to do that. Like I would love a book because, like I said, part of the reason I've never written a fantasy is I'm intimidated by the the idea of creating a world and a magic system or anything like that. And so I would love a book that was like helpful. That's kind of what I was hoping this would do, was sort of like, you know, walk me through that process. Like, how can you, and I don't know if that's an easy thing to explain, but that's just sort of what I was looking for and would have liked more of, you know?
Yeah. Well, okay. So Emily H said on the flip side, so many historical European fantasies have potatoes, and potatoes didn't exist in Europe till the trade with America started. I understand that. I understand where you're coming from, but at the same time, why, if it's a fantasy, you can have potatoes in Europe. Like, you can do whatever you want. It's a fantasy.
Yeah, because it's not Europe.
Yeah, it's not Europe. It may be based on a medieval Europe where they didn't have those things. And like, if you're trying to like base it solely on that and like 100%, then sure, yeah. But I feel like I could have, like, if you can have dragons, you can have potatoes. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there's a couple of good comments here. Kirsten said, I feel like it should be accurate enough for the immersion, but you don't need to be an expert on anything. The feeling during a fight scene is more important than the mechanics.
Yeah.
And Ashley said, I believe in your fantasy that things like gravity should work, but if your characters fly, they fly. I don't need to study birds for 10 years to slap wings on a human and say fly.
Yeah.
I would be totally here for a potato dragon.
Well, like, for instance, like I read, like in the Game of Thrones books, there's lots of battle scenes, and George R. R. Martin has talked about how he's read extensively on battles. Like, he knows all the things. I'm reading those scenes. I would not know that he read anything about battles. Like, they're so bare bones that like all the research he says he's done, it was like, to me, a waste, because like I feel like anybody could have written that scene the way he did.
Yeah.
I mean, when I started writing fight scenes, I started writing fight scenes mostly with like daggers and short swords. And so I have daggers and short swords. And so I would like hold them and feel like what felt most comfortable in my hand, or if I was making a movement, like what was the most comfortable way for me to make that movement. And like that kind of helped me figure out how to do it versus like watching someone else do it.
Yeah.
Or reading about it, like actually physically putting myself in that situation. So I think if it's something where you can put yourself in a similar situation, I think that does more for you than it does like studying the mechanics of how things work.
I actually think that's a great point. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, actually, like that like your own personal experience. And I think that's kind of along the lines of what people are talking about when they say like, write what you know. It's like, what have you felt or experienced? Like, I just think you're going to describe things better. And that's really more like, that's better than like watching somebody else. Like, okay, weird side example, but a couple of days ago, my husband and I were having dinner and he started choking. Like real choking, like someone who would like choke and die. And I have never felt so panicked in my life in that second. I mean, it only lasted like a second and then everything was like fine. But in that one like second, like I've never felt like that. And I've described a million times like how someone has been panicked. But now that I've actually felt like in an emergency, a panic of that kind of situation, the way I would describe it is going to be so much more like vivid and descriptive. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and start choking people.
Do it.
The point I'm trying to make is that experience yourself is so different from conveying than like reading something in a textbook or like watching it. And that's why like there's only some things you can only do so much research on, you know, and really be able to understand that. I'm not saying unless you've seen someone choke, you can't write about them choking. I'm certainly not saying that. I'm just talking about what, you know, sort of what you're saying, that like the fact that you held the dagger and you moved it is going to make you able to sort of think about that in more complex ways when you're writing it to feel more accurate.
Really quick, Ashley said that, I'm assuming you meant George didn't know about writing battle scenes. He said that the Shediversity rips Battle of Winterfell to shreds. He didn't write that episode. Benioff did. So I understand that, like, I don't know, people could do all the research they want. Doesn't mean that they're, I don't know. Gila said you should be consistent with your world logic. As long as it makes sense in your world, it's fine.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I definitely think, yeah, same here, Moon. My husband has a sword, and that's why I can't imagine ever doing anything with it because I like grab it and then like my hand just wants to fall off. Like I could never just even hold it up straight. I'm also very weak though. So
When I go to the Renaissance Festival, I always make friends with the pirates and hang out there for a while. And they let you play with their shiny swords. So
oh my god, I'm sure they did, Jessica. Wink.
They sure do. Once when I was at the Renaissance Festival, there was a pirate who was like guarding the hoard of treasure, which is really just like small knives that they sell to people. And there was some little girl that was like afraid of him and like started to run away. And he was like, "Hey, don't be afraid. I don't bite." And then as she like ran away, he looked at me and said, "Only on the nipple." And I went, "What?"
Oh my god.
The Renaissance Festival is a great place, and I highly recommend it for everyone. Go hang out with the pirates; they're the most fun.
If we ever have them again.
That too.
That's great advice, Ruth. Ruth says talking to reenactors is a great way to get random details to help you with world building too. Yeah, 100%. And she does talk about that in this book. Like, talk to people. Like, if you're doing a job, like if you're talking about a job that you've never had, I definitely think that talking to someone who's had the job is better than reading about the job because they're going to give you those little like insider things that aren't always translated.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Jessica, you said you had a couple of things marked.
I do.
She's like, "Oh damn, my time has come."
I have red flags.
Time for the airing of grievances.
My first red flag, my aired grievance is her stance on second person point of view. Basically, her point of view is that you shouldn't ever do it ever, and people who do are stupid.
Yeah.
And I went, well, obviously she's never read the 5th season because it's done beautifully in the 5th season. And I didn't even love that book, and I think it was done beautifully in the 5th season. So first off, I'm going to need you to take your snooty butt and go somewhere else. Like, very rude about it. Like,
yeah. There were a couple of instances where she did stuff like that. Yeah.
And the other one was also here you go. Don't even think of adding a glossary at the end of your manuscript. You are not Mr. Tolkien. You do not rate his privileges. Listen, some of my favorite parts of books, especially when they're not from my white person perspective, are glossaries.
Yes.
I love to learn more about other cultures and other people and other things. And so when you give me a glossary and I can learn things, I love that.
Didn't she say something like, not to add a glossary where like it has the pronunciations? Like, I love that.
Yeah.
Like, I love those. And it felt very dismissive of like, again, like a different culture. If I don't know how to pronounce something, I like having the glossary that then teaches me something, teaches me how to pronounce things. I like that. So to say that you're not on the same level of J.R.R. Tolkien, neither are you, Deborah Chester.
First off, I've never heard of you. So
apparently she's written over 40 books, including the Ruby Throne trilogy, which is YA.
To me, to say that like a glossary is not important is saying that other people's, like, the knowledge is not important.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's a hard disagree. I feel like even in regular YA contemporary novels, if it's something that's outside of the white perspective, which is what most people know, like if they're marketing a YA book to us, it's what we know. I love glossaries because
I love glossaries, maps, love all of it.
Right, because it gives me more insight into that world. It helps me learn things. Like, it gives you an idea of because some things can have more than one meaning depending on different cultures. So it gives you the exact meaning of what that author was trying to portray. Like,
I mean, maybe I'm like one of the, not a normal reader, I guess. I don't know. But I love that kind of stuff. Like, I would read, if I really love a world, I would read an entire book about that world, an entire glossary, basically, of that world. Like, I love that stuff. I love world building and reading about world building. And so, like, if you have a whole glossary about your world, I'll read it if I love your book. So maybe I'm like,
and there are obviously readers out there who feel like that because, like, Rick Riordan has glossaries about his Percy Jackson series. Cassie Clare has glossaries about the Shadowhunter series. Like they, in the bigger worlds, the bigger series that do sell well, they make those things and people buy them. So there are people that are interested in them.
I like Ashley said, so we have to spend 6 months researching swordplay, but we can't have a glossary.
I did. I found that page, Jessica, and I actually had written, I thought I wrote something too. I wrote, with a question mark, because she said the disadvantage of second person is that it breaks the fourth wall and destroys reader suspension of disbelief. And I categorically disagree. I would agree that you don't see second person often. It's very hard to pull off. And this is not a fantasy example, but one of my favorite stories by, Diaz that I used to teach when I was teaching is second person. And it is absolutely beautiful when it's done well. It like will blow your mind when you read something in second person. And so to say that it like breaks the fourth wall and that it's experimental and you can't suspend disbelief, I just don't think that's true.
The advantages are literally, she says, I know of none.
Yeah.
Really?
Here's the thing.
Know one?
Here's the thing, is I'll say that it's difficult to do, but that doesn't mean it can't be done.
Right. Yeah. But there was several instances where she did stuff like that, where she was just basically like, don't do this, or like, you shouldn't do this. And I just thought, says who? Like, like, I don't know.
That would have made you queen.
Yeah. Again, it's the tone that I feel like really strange. I don't know. Like, it's very weird for me. I feel like a lot of these craft books do it. But somebody asked if that means this book is a hard pass. And I would not say that. We're just airing grievances at this point.
Yeah.
Because I do feel like there were some things I did want to talk about that I felt like were I don't know that they were necessarily brand new ideas, but I did like the way she presented some stuff.
Yeah.
We should talk about good things now.
Yeah.
It's been an hour of Jessica trashing this book.
A couple of other things then before we get into that. I didn't like when she talked about writing groups. I feel like that really spoke to the kind of person she was. Where she said she didn't like writing groups because it's mostly people asking you to read out loud and then tell you that you did well.
Yeah.
That is so like not even like what writing group is she in? That is not true.
Yeah,
I've been torn to shreds in writing groups, okay?
But in a couple of things that I did like they're just kind of quick things. I did like the discussion on contracts, book contracts. So in her section on publishing, I think she gave some helpful advice on book contracts. I do think that's stuff that we don't come across as often, especially in a craft book, because it's not craft. So weird that it's in here. But I did find it useful to explain that kind of stuff, because if you don't know somebody already, like I already know people who are published traditionally, so like I've heard some of this stuff before, but definitely if you're like a noob and you don't know anyone, like some of this stuff is lost to you, and some people get taken advantage of and they don't know these types of things. And so I do think that section on like publication and stuff, some of that was really helpful, and I did feel like it was current. Like it was current good advice, I felt like. And then I also liked at the end that she referred to writing as a performing art. I like thinking of writing as a performing art. I feel like it makes you think about writing differently.
She does also in that section, however, say that like self-publishing is a last resort if you can't get regular published. It's not.
How did I miss that?
What page is that on?
How did I miss your thing, man?
Oh God, it's on page. It's after the book contracts. You were in like a book contract. This is great.
Digital publishing?
313, yeah, digital publishing. So like on the second page, she's like, possibly you've tried submitting your manuscript the conventional way and been rejected. Now you want to try a different route. Like,
as if it's always the second choice, and that's
right.
Not true at all.
That's not accurate. Some people just choose self-publishing because they prefer to be in control.
Yeah.
And that's fine. So it's a very outdated version of what self-publishing is also, but I do like that she puts in here that if a company expects a hefty fee up front,
I was just about to say that.
It's probably dangerous territory. So I do like that she put that part in there, but also, on the other hand, why did we go there?
Like, yeah, I do think that she's reflecting still a very old way of thinking about digital publishing that is thankfully changing. But yeah.
I will say, just like my own personal opinion off of what this does for fantasy and what other things I have read have done for fantasy, is that I think like there are authors who have information on their websites or free things that are better than this.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that as well, because I feel like I've seen a lot of good writing advice from like newsletters, from author newsletters. So Susan Dennard is a good one. I've never actually read any of Susan Dennard's books, but I have her newsletter because I like her writing advice. I think it's very helpful.
And it's all on her website. You can go through it like in order. It's great.
Yeah.
I feel like Jessica just got a lady boner here in soon.
Yeah.
Like that.
She is my queen.
But I was actually talking to Alexa about that as well previously when we were talking about thrillers. Just like, why aren't people who are currently writing these things and writing these things well writing the books on how to do it? And
because they're busy writing books.
Yeah, exactly. But we need that.
That's why we're getting this stuff from 60-year-old white women who have nothing left to write and they're angry.
So really quick, something that I'm just curious, which no one has to answer this, but on page 317, when she's talking about self-publishing, she says that if you can afford them, consider contracting professional public relations services that can promote you online. And I feel like, is that really worth it? I want to talk to somebody that has self-publishes or indie publishes, and do you really think it's worth hiring a PR company to push your book, or would it be better to take that money and put it into like BookBub ads or Goodreads ads?
I think Jesse Elliott did publish a promotion company for the third book.
I'm just wondering though, like, is it worth it?
Was it did she?
I would like to talk to somebody that's done it, and I'm just curious if that's actually worth it, because she says like, oh, if you can afford it, but I wonder if you actually see a return on that.
That's the only person I know off the top of my head that did like some kind of a.
I have a friend who traditionally publishes that for their first book, hired a PR company and said it was a waste of money. It would never do it again.
Becca said she hired a PR company. It was not worth it at all, but it could have been the company.
So that's what I'm wondering. It's like, is it worth the return, or is it worth it just to? Because like I feel like, especially nowadays when you have so many resources, like the Courtney Project talks about, if you're indie publishing, ways to use money to figure out that stuff yourself. And there are so many resources to do it now that I wonder if that is just like an old way of thinking. Like, you don't need to when there's so many free resources that will tell you how to better spend that money on doing your own PR.
Yeah.
I was just curious. There's just something I was interested about.
Okay, so I feel like we've aired our grievances. Do we want to transition into some of the things we did like about it?
The ending.
Y'all have examples of things you liked, or should I jump in, or?
I mean, you can jump in if you want, or Jessica can jump in if you
Well,
want.
I think one thing that happens really early in the beginning is she talks about spook, the SPOOC, like when you're trying to test a concept. And the spook stands for situation, protagonist, objective, opponent, and climax. And
she could have come up with a better acronym, though.
I agree 100% with that.
She could have put coops.
She wanted to put a spook test.
Yeah. Again, questionable. Needs to hire me as
I refuse to say that in my head because I hate it so much. So I kept calling it the OOC test, and it's just cumbersome. There's a freaking gnat in here.
I call it the Spock test, but the audiobook does say spook.
Does it?
Oh.
Yeah. I call it the Spock test. I feel bad for the person who read the audiobook who had to
call it the Coops test. I mean, come on.
All right.
Coops test.
But while it sounds really simplistic, I actually think it's helpful to have this sort of checklist when you're trying to decide if what you have is enough to move forward with the next step of planning. Yeah. Because I think oftentimes some of these things, even for myself, I'm like, oh, I don't have this yet. Like, I mean, you're probably going to have the protagonist, but do you always have the objective? Do you always have like the opponent? She's saying like, you need to figure all of these things out and test it. And she gave sort of examples where like some of those things were missing, right? And then I felt like that was helpful.
Yeah, I did like that section that she it's a good way to make, like you said, make sure you have all the different things, because then I was going through all my book ideas and I was like trying to, and she's like talk about condensing them into like a couple sentences or whatever. And I was doing that for all my books to make sure that I was like, am I on the right path? So I do like that. I do like that. I think the reason though that we liked that is because it was an actionable step, whereas most of her things were just tips.
Yes.
It's similar vein, page 8, where she has the different types of hooks, and like it's a chart and tells you like what kind of hook it is, how you use it, where you should use it at. Like that's great. I love that. Like charts. I want charts and facts.
Yeah, 100%.
Like direction.
Yeah, and I think she speaking too of the check that she has, another thing that she says to do is that each of your books should have a story question that can be answered at the end by yes or no. Right? It has to be a yes or no question. Like, does she save the day, or does she get the crown, or whatever, whatever, have a sort of question that so that you have something that you're moving towards, at the end, and kind of simplifying that. I think sometimes the things that are really simple are the things that we often overlook or forget. So I did find that helpful.
One thing that really, really, really stood out to me, and I've heard it before, but for some reason it just stood out to me, was it wasn't even something she said. It was in the, actually, I think it was something, or no, it was in the author preface, so she did say it. On page 11 of the XI, not actual 11, she says, and although fantasy expects readers to believe these things just because it offers no rational basis for them, fantasy is not illogical. And that really stood out to me, that like, she talks about it with her magic system too, is like when she does talk about the magic system for like a paragraph, that like it's not just random, there's a source for it. Like it, like you said, like it can, like in science fiction, you can have something that is like really out there, but it has to be based in something. Like it has to
make sense, and that is logical.
Yes, and I liked that. I like that. Like it's not illogical. It's not like just all this random, stuff happening all over the place. Like there is some kind of semblance of it making sense, if that makes sense. I don't know. I like that sentence a lot.
Yeah.
It stood out to me.
The one thing I did have a question about, which maybe I haven't read enough craft books and I'm not smart, because again, I couldn't write this book, but what do I know? She gives similar billing to the antagonist as she does to the protagonist.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's not the case in most books that I've read. As far as like their importance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had some questions about that too. Because I feel like this is not the first craft book where we've gotten like the emphasis. I mean, fantasy is different though, because like I don't write fantasy, and that's why I was saying like that was something like I'm less sure on. It sounded like for what she's trying to say is that for fantasy, like the antagonist is like super, super important. And I don't know, I'm trying to think of fantasy, like you said, like similar weight, because like I write contemporary where there's technically usually not like a villain, you know what I mean? Like it's much more vague than that. So I don't know, like, and I've read some fantasy, but I don't read a lot of it. So
I mean, I think it might also depend on, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe it depends on like adult versus young adult, because I feel like,
well, Voldemort, if we're going to talk about.
True.
Well, we're not going to.
Harry Potter, then he has a pretty big, we get a lot of.
She talked about Voldemort enough. We don't need to talk about him.
You can't say his name.
I should say Voldemort. I hate when people say that.
Yeah, I don't know, because like, it's also hard because like in like Game of Thrones, for instance, like who is the villain, right? Like, there are some people that are like naturally bad, but there's a lot of gray area.
There's not a villain, right? Yeah. There's not like protagonist, antagonist.
Yeah. And it's actually questionable who the protagonist is even. So like, and then there's books like, okay, so for instance, I know Jessica hates these books. Robin Hobb, Royal Assassin. So like there is like a main bad guy, but I would not say he's as important as he's not even really the main bad guy. There is an antagonist.
Bad guy, the guy that describes paper for 6 pages, or is that just me?
No, but like his uncle is like one of the antagonists.
Oh yeah.
I wouldn't say he's anywhere near as important as because like he's not even the main conflict of the novels. Like the main conflict is there's basically zombies in this book too, which I felt like okay, you and George R. Martin, because they're like really good friends. I'm like, did you guys write the same book? But anyway, like that's the main issue. So even though there is an antagonist, I wouldn't say he's as important as Fitz, the main character.
I mean, there are books that certainly where I feel like the antagonist is as important as the protagonist, but it's typically when your antagonist is like your setting, or like whether it's like a haunted house or severe elements or something that is present the whole time you're in the novel versus like, I don't know, not always being in the novel. I don't know, like I'm trying to like think of one that's on my shelf that's like super well known.
Lizelle said in Six of Crows, how often is Pekka Rollins or whoever actually in it? I haven't read Six of Crows, so I don't know.
But the Darkling was it was in a lot of the first Grisha trilogy book, which I've only ever read the first.
Same.
Okay, but to be fair, the Darkling is not.
Be careful what you.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
yes,
spoiling the whole premise of the book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I just read it last month, so there may be some stragglers out there.
Me.
Well, okay, let's say.
This is one of those ones that's so old that don't ruin Six of Crows for me, but like the Grisha trilogy, I'm not as invested in.
I knew what was going to happen because it's been 20 years, so it's fine. But if we talk like go to like, you know, my other hero, Cassie Clare, and just because she sells a lot of books, not really because she writes them well, but that's another topic. So like the first, like it's a 6-book series, but the main villain changes from 1 to 3 and 4 to 6.
Yeah.
So how is that the antagonist is as important when the antagonist for the first 3 books doesn't exist in the second set of books? Like, I understand the concept.
That makes me wonder, like Pretty Little Liars, which is a contemporary. So like it had a villain. The books had a villain, but then when the show came out and it became popular, she started writing new books. It was like, just kidding, there's this other villain, and it's like, was it really? Well, and those though, I would argue that the villain in that is very important. I mean, it's the whole reason why the whole book series is happening.
But your antagonist is not always the same person, because in trying to figure out who the antagonist is, the people who are actually your protagonists are being antagonistic against other people.
Yeah, and I would say that like I would not put them as top billing in the same level, like who that person is and like the complexity of that character and their development and their whatever. Especially not in Pretty Little Liars, I would not.
Just read the first Pretty Little Liars and hated it.
Yeah,
we were supposed to be talking about good things, and I got us on a tangent of bad things again. So let's bring it back to.
Well, I mean, with Cassie Clare, here's my defense of that, I guess. Is that like it kind of reminds me of, for instance, one of my favorite shows, Charmed. So like each season has an arc of like this is the bad guy, and then second season there's a whole other antagonist. So like I guess it's kind of how I just imagine books like Cassie Clare's. It's like, okay, the first 3 books are an arc, a trilogy, season arc of a TV show basically, and then there's a new antagonist. But usually there is still an overarching main villain.
Yeah. Well, Nicole says in the chat, I think it's important for the author to know about the antagonist, but some fantasies have different levels of antagonist importance in the story. Mm-hmm. So I think for some, like for example, like the Grisha verse with the Darkling, he had a much more significant aspect of the plot overall, as opposed to just being the antagonist, right? He played a larger role in that. So I do think I just think it's depends. You know, it just depends, and maybe she's kind of basing that on a more traditional idea of fantasy, especially if she's using Harry Potter so much. But Harry Potter is not the standard in which all fantasy must be mirrored against.
Well, she even said that in Harry Potter, Voldemort never comes around. And so the actual billing of the antagonist is that you're always wondering when he's going to come back. He's always going to come back at midterm season and then a little bit more at finals.
Yeah.
Like he's going to come at the end of the book, But so like she even goes against her own advice because saying that Voldemort should be top billing along with Harry Potter because he's Voldemort and he's the antagonist. But then you get like 2 lines about him throughout the entire book.
I get that she's saying that, like, I think ultimately what she's trying to say is don't have a flat antagonist, that they should be...
Fair enough.
Yeah.
They should be complex, which is against what James and Frey said, that your antagonist should be flat evil. But she didn't really... I feel like she was alluding to that without saying that, which it would have been better if she just said it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't have a flat antagonist, which again is 101. Like, don't have a cackling evil person for no reason. Like, even for instance, I keep talking about Game of Thrones, but it's just because I just finished one of the books. Like, Cersei, for anyone that's watched the show, Cersei comes across as evil, but she has her reasons. A lot of what she's doing is...
She's a much more complicated character.
Yeah, she's doing it to protect her children and protect her family. So, like, she has reasons. So she might be doing evil things, but she's doing it for a reason, like, you know what I mean? So, like, it's not so, like, black and white. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the reasons why I didn't like Voldemort, is that he is just evil. But it's because his mom used a love spell to have a baby, and that made him evil because he can't experience love. Whatever.
To be fair, his mom wasn't doing that love spell to have a baby.
No, she's, I mean, it was straight up, she was raping him.
Yeah, but let's put that in a book for kids.
Yeah. One thing that actually kind of reminded me really quick that I thought she said that I thought was interesting is that she does say, Deborah Chester says that fantasy is more process interested than result interested. Like the people that read fantasy are more interested in the process than the result. And I'm wondering if that accounts for the endless.
What does she mean by that? Like, is that what you mean?
Interested in the journey rather than the destination. But I just feel like, couldn't you say that for all books?
I don't know, because...
Or maybe that's what she's saying is the reason why there's so many, like, long training scenes. And
I don't like those. I don't like those scenes.
I hate those.
Only in Mulan are those appropriate.
You
have to sing a song, otherwise I'm not interested.
Like, okay, I'm very sorry. It's just because it's the most recent fantasy in my life, but in Game of Thrones. I'm very sorry. But I just got finished reading one of them. It's like, you can mention that there was training. I don't feel like you need to show the training for chapters and chapters. It could be like, we just got done with the training session. I'm fine with that. I love that. I don't want to read about training. You can talk about how
Mass will devote half a book to it.
I'm okay with you just being like, that's another example, yeah. Like, I'm okay with you just being like, I'm sore because we trained all day. I don't need to see it. I'm okay with you just talking about how sore you are, how much it sucked. But that could just be a reading preference. Like, again,
I think a lot of people do like that stuff though in fantasy.
I mean, that's cool.
What
I'm
draws
okay
them
with
to
like a page to 2 pages of you like going through the motions of being in training, but not all the time and not full chapters.
Yeah.
Like if you do a page or 2 a couple of times throughout the book, that's fine.
Yeah, that's different. But even like in the Royal whatever book, one of them, there was like an entire chapter about where they're training like their mental powers, and I was so bored.
Yeah.
I don't want to read about that was so boring to me that I just wanted to skip over it.
That's why I stopped reading the Sarah J. Maas Throne of Glass series. Is the train like there were some other things I didn't like about it, but the training stuff was just so much that I was just so bored with it. I was like, okay, I don't care.
Well,
I'm
okay.
only on book 1, so I don't
Okay.
know.
So Phoebe said, I low-key love training, but usually if there's simultaneously character development in relationships, like sparring with your love interest. Yes, please.
Yeah.
And then Lizelle said, I love full training thing. That's why I love when they go to fantasy school. Here's my caveat. I don't want to read a whole chapter of you training something if it doesn't then add to the story. Like, for instance, in the first Royal Assassin book, the Farseer trilogy, the entire training scene where he's learning his mental powers, I could have skipped that whole chapter. It would have been like, I didn't. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't actually add to the story in any way that mattered long term, that I literally could have skipped an entire chapter and nothing would have been any different. And that's what I feel like at that point, then you're just filling pages to fill pages.
Yeah, or like in Vampire Academy when Rose is like training with Dimitri, like there's things happening, right? It's a love interest.
Yeah,
so
yeah, that is different. That's adding to the relationship.
There's other things that are going on. So
yeah, it needs to be adding to something, because if it's not, then what's the point of you adding in there, just to show that you did do the research to figure out how this training was to go?
Yeah.
That again, though, that's a personal preference. Like, some people like that stuff. I just feel like you should still add to the story. If you're going to do a whole chapter on training, I think you should add to the story. If I can skip a whole chapter of your book and nothing changes, that's a problem.
Yeah. Like, and I think that kind of brings me to something else that she talks about, because I'm curious how a training scene, what she would categorize as that, because something that she did in the book that I found really fascinating and I hadn't heard before is what she uses to qualify as a scene. Because I feel like all the other craft books we read, like, everything is a scene, right? There's all scenes. She does not say that everything you write is a scene. There are scenes and there are sequels. She uses the word sequels, which was confusing at first, to not mean like a sequel to your book. She means them as what comes after a scene. And then there's also like smaller like transitions. And she also mentions scene setups.
Okay, but I learned about that in middle school.
But I feel like when we're talking about like writing craft books, I feel like we always talk about everything in terms of a scene, like it's a scene. And she's saying that a scene is very specific. Her definition of a scene is very different than what I've been seeing in other craft books. So like, she's saying that very specifically a scene is a confrontation between two or more people. And that not everything written in a book is a scene. And then her definition of sequels is, she kind of uses it as it compares it in a, like, as opposed to a scene. So she says if scenes are dramatic units that are all conflict and change, sequels are dramatic units that feature internalization, emotion, and planning.
Yeah.
So it goes in between things, but I don't know, like.
Well, it seems like there are people in chat saying that there are better things to explain it better online.
But I've always heard it called scene and sequel. And so
I've never heard that before.
Oh, I have. So to me, that was just like, all right, what else did I learn in kindergarten?
Yeah.
Let's move
Phoebe
on.
said that there's a whole book called Scene and Sequel that goes really deep on that theory. See, I've never heard of that before.
I just didn't like the term sequel. It was confusing. Like, if you called it something else, I would have been fine with it.
Like, I've always, in all the craft books prior to this that I've read, everything's just a scene.
Yeah.
And in fact, writing deep scenes, she talks about all the different scenes. And so some of the things that she would call, I forget the terms off the top of my head, a certain kind of scene, she's calling them a sequel. So I just thought that was an interesting way to kind of, I don't know, I'd never heard that before.
I don't know where I heard it. I just, like, she said it and I was like, all right, cool. And just, like it was a thing I already knew.
Yeah, because especially like in writing deep scenes, like she has like 16 different types of scenes. And so.
See, I was actually really side note. I was disappointed when I got to that section because I thought it was going to be about writing fantasy sequels. Like books. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Like I've never written a sequel.
That would have been helpful. Like I thought it was a little weird when I thought it was going to be about sequels. So I was like, whoa, why are we jumping to writing sequels already?
You haven't even told me how to read or how to write the first book. So,
yeah, I expected at that point.
I did kind of like the idea of scene and sequel because a dichotomy like that is easier to think about for me than to think about, okay, there's 16 types of scenes and this is this kind of scene. And like, it just kind of oversimplifies it in a good way that like, there has to be, because, okay, I guess what I'm trying to say is in my own book, I have scenes, right, where I don't feel like they are the same as like scenes where things are happening. And so then it makes me feel like I need to make things happen in it in order for it to be a scene. And so by qualifying it as a sequel,
it's like the fallout of a scene.
Right. And having like, this is what should happen in the afterwards is helpful for me to think about the function of that, what happens immediately after what she's calling a scene.
I really liked what Gila said, that scene sequel is the same as action reaction for me, but on a bigger scale.
Yes. And that's what, and I actually thought the action reaction was helpful, like thinking in terms of pairing. I think it's something we just kind of do naturally, but I think that sometimes when we come across things like plot holes or things where people aren't connecting with things, it's maybe because we missed that pairing of an action and a reaction, or having like an action without a reaction after it, or not being clear, or there being too big of a gap. So that's why I thought that was helpful. And so if we're thinking about scenes and sequels in the same way, I think that that's helpful as well, because I felt like in my book, in my writing, I was having a lot of scenes, and now I'm realizing there's not enough sequels in between the scenes, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I would love a book on writing sequels. Jessica said Art Readings has the whole series on writing a series. So I tried to,
go ahead.
I was going with that sentence. Sometimes I start talking and I don't know where I'm going with it.
And then she also, of course, talks about scene positions and then transitions, which don't really fall into specific scenes, or like you're setting up the scene, and then also when you're like transitioning between time and place. I also just have a problem with chapters. That's just a personal issue that I have, of knowing when a new chapter should begin. I wish that some of these craft books would actually like give advice on that. Like, I don't know if I'm just dumb, but it's just like, I know that like you can say it in theory, like, oh, when this is whatever, but like I feel like when it comes to my own book, it's like, should every scene be a chapter? What scene should be in the same chapter? Like, so I don't know. So maybe thinking about, so then I wish she would have said like, okay. And then, because she does give some like really direct numbers that I found helpful. Like she was like, oh, if you're writing this kind of fantasy, you should have this many perspectives, and like a longer kind of fantasy should have no more than like this. Again, they're just her opinion, but I did find that at least helpful to have like a ballpark. Like there was one page where she was like, this kind of book should have 40 scenes, and this one should have like 60 or 80. Because I'm always wondering, how many scenes should I have? How long should the scenes be? Like, I want someone to give me ballpark numbers on these kinds of things.
I just feel like it's a little arbitrary, though.
I mean, I feel like there is some warrant to it, that there are things that just typically tend to land in that way, and to have a ballpark figure, like you shouldn't have a book that has 450 scenes in it, you know, like.
Yeah. But I think that's just common sense, that like ballpark, I feel like it's just common sense.
I'm saying for me, it's not common sense. I need it. Because I can't figure out where to begin and end chapters.
Usually at the end of a sentence.
Yeah, that you would think, but
I thought you meant
always that clear cut, Jessica.
I thought you meant one sentence, and I was like, sure, do your thing, Jessica. I mean, there are chapters that are one sentences in books that are very effective.
Phoebe says she sucks at transitions. It is literally the thing that gives me the most anxiety about writing, is transitions, because like my books tend to span a long period of time. And so I write in first person. I think it's different when you're writing third person. There's like an easier like narration element to it. But when you're writing first person, it's really hard to I feel like transition, especially when they say like, don't start chapters like this and don't start chapters like this. And it's like, okay, well then how do I get you to where we're at here? Like, I don't know. I feel like I look at a lot of books and how they transition between stuff, but then when I try to do it myself, I'm not good at
it. The other thing she talked about, I think like in the same area, was like, if you are starting writing fantasy and this is your first book, do not write a book with like 87 different points of view.
Yeah.
It's solid advice.
It felt like a personal attack, but I agreed with it. Like,
right. I felt personally attacked, but also hard to agree.
Because I've written other books, and I have a fantasy idea that has many, not like as many as George R. R. Martin, but it has multiple points of view. And now I'm just like, oh, maybe I'm not ready for it.
I mean, I started writing mine like 15 years ago and did a lot of work on it for like 3 or 4 years, and then gave up, and then did some work for a couple of years and then gave up. And now I'm basically rewriting the entire thing. And that's because 15 years ago I wasn't ready to write it. So,
yeah.
She's not wrong. I feel attacked, but she's not wrong. I'm going to send Merlin to her house so she can have some of my cat hair.
She did, talking about scenes too, something else that she mentioned that I found helpful. Again, I don't think she's reinventing the wheel here, but there was just something about the way she simplified it helped for me, is she was saying that like each of your scenes should end with like a yes, a no, a yes, but, or no, and furthermore. So like something I've struggled with is connecting scenes, especially like in a contemporary where you're trying to like, again, that like action reaction, like, because in Story Genius, Lisa Krohn talks about like how every scene, like the next scene should be like inevitable. Like, of course, that's what happens next, right? Because you set it up for that. And so I feel like that has been kind of a struggle for me. Like she essentially argues that like, if you can move scenes around, then you are not putting enough purpose into those scenes, because they shouldn't be able to be moved around. They should have to work in the order that they're there. And if not, then you need to go back and work on those scenes. And so I thought about that in terms of what she's saying is that there should be an answer to all your scene resolutions. Like there's a, I don't know if I wrote it down, but she said something like every scene should have like a question, and then you answer it at the end with either yes, no, yes, but, or no, and furthermore.
Yeah.
So I don't know. What did you guys think of that?
I mean,
Can I agree to disagree?
Sure.
Let me see if I can figure out where that's at.
what page was it on?
In my notes.
I unfortunately did not, but it's in the scene resolution section.
Oh. I mean,
Why did she have to write Jessica with a K? Like, she's not that cool.
I don't necessarily disagree, but the way that she worded it was a little confusing. I had to read it twice. Where you're like, I don't know, the way you just read it again. I was like, that's right. That was confusing when I read it, but like, it made sense once I reread it. But I also, to be honest, it could have just been me not paying close enough attention the first time I read it.
Yeah, it's on page 129.
Okay.
God, I didn't feel like it was that far in. Where was I at?
It says options for scene resolutions. In elemental story design, the 4 possible ways in which to end a scene are yes, no, yes, but, or no, and furthermore.
I mean, she's not wrong.
I
So
feel like
a scene question, and those are your 4 possible answers. And then she does give like description, or she gives examples of like, because I feel like the answer to the questions is helping you set up the next scene.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I found. I found that helpful. Especially the one where she's talking about like the yes, but like, yeah, she was able to accomplish this, but now this new problem has arisen. Right. And, or the, no, she didn't solve this issue. And now even furthermore, this new complication has been added to it. Right. So like, I think by having that, and it's something that when I create my new outline, which I'm going to be doing soon on my channel on how to outline books, I'm actually going to add that to it, because I have like scene cards based on Story Genius, and I want to be able to answer that question in each of them, like have the story question and the answer, because I feel like that is helpful to transition into the next scene.
I want to talk about how in the comments, every time we talk about something that's in this book that we think is confusing or like isn't explained very well, someone's like, yes, she wrote it, but also this other person wrote about it and it was way better done. Like every single time.
I think the reason why behind that is because she doesn't go into enough depth for a lot of these subjects.
That's why I said it's just like a lot of tips and not a lot of process.
Whereas like for instance, that Mary Robinette Cowell's video, I'm sure is that whole video about the subject. If it is, I'm sure she goes into more depth than what Deborah did. And I think that's the issue, is that she just didn't go in depth enough with her.
It's very much just like a beginner's thing. I don't think it's a horrible book. I think if you're a beginner, I think it will be great for you. I think if you don't know a lot about how to structure a novel, it will be helpful for you.
And I definitely don't think you should end here, though. Like, go on to get better explanation or to get deeper dives into some of these topics. But yeah, that was maybe sort of the issue, is that she's trying to address too many. And so none of them are in depth enough. But I definitely want to, the yes, but, no, and I'm going to look into that video, because I actually really like that, even in the way that she explained it. was helpful for me. So to get a even more like complex explanation, because like I said, that's something I've struggled with, that like in the past, my book, the scenes could very easily happen out of order. And I'm realizing that like, that's something I'm working on in my revision or my rewrites, is like, they need to be more purposeful. Like they need to be more connected, and the things that happen later should not just be random scenes I've created, but rather inevitable movements throughout, you know, within the story.
I think that something to think this book as is that a jumping off point, that if you like certain sections, to maybe dive deeper into those sections elsewhere. Like Laura said, like if you like that yes but no section, to then deeper dive somewhere else, because again, I just don't feel like she dove deep enough into some of these things. But if you liked them, it's a jumping off.
Yeah, because like you said, it is, especially if I know that like someone's saying there's a book on scenes and sequels. I actually really liked her explanation of sequels, but all she really kind of provides is, oh, a sequel should consist of emotional aftermath, analytical thought, review of previous story events, weighing of options, making a decision, and taking action. So it's like, it's just like a very like 2-sentence. That's what I was saying when I said I didn't like the organization of this book, because it's just like short little paragraphs about 500 million different topics.
Yeah.
You know, like so many topics to just barely scratch the surface on them.
And none of them told me how to write a fantasy novel.
Agree. I think it was helpful to see it applied to fantasy, but there was nothing really helping. This did not help you learn how to write a fantasy. It's how to learn to write. And then like, here's some fantasy examples.
I think it was more of a what not to do than a what.
There was a lot more of that.
Yeah,
I would agree. It felt like she was kind of like annoyed by a lot of things she's been seeing lately. So she's like, I'm going to write a book to stop all this stuff from happening. People don't know what they're doing, type of thing.
I wonder if she gives her students this book to read as part of their, what's that thing called? Their syllabus.
Kevin, are you the one who told me about that?
Yeah, Marissa Mohi messaged. She replied to my story. Marissa, it was her thesis advisor was Deborah Chester.
So Marissa had her as an instructor. So I think that would be interesting to get Marissa
said that.
Note to self: don't tell Marissa to watch this video. Got it. Okay.
No, Marissa said that Deborah seemed like the type that she would rather be writing than teaching.
Yeah, and that unfortunately, coming from a former, college instructor, is the case for most instructors. They'd rather be doing their own work rather than teaching. Teaching is a means to an end, unfortunately.
Lizelle, professors always do that because then the students have to buy them. Is that why she wrote the book?
I mean, maybe actually.
Some schools, like one of the universities that I taught at, you were not allowed to assign a book that you wrote.
Well, the press is Manchester University Press.
Yeah, but she teaches that in Oklahoma.
But my question is it made specifically? But I want to know more about that press.
Yeah, is that like
books that are used in college classes?
They do other.
I haven't come across that, but I don't know.
I think that they do other writing craft books. There was one that I own that was published by them also. Press. I don't remember which one it was though, but I remember seeing it and thinking like, oh yeah.
Merlin, where are you hitting the enter key on the keyboard? I can just see the thing going across the screen.
Something else she said, if we're talking about scenes, that I wanted to get your guys' opinion on, everyone's. She said in her definition of a scene, she says that the goal at the end of every scene should be that things are worse for the protagonist.
I disagree with that. I think that Save the Cat Rights novel even talks about that it should be the fun game should be an up and down.
Yeah, I don't think she's necessarily disagreeing with that, but that something in it should make something worse for even if there's a small victory in it. She said that was what I think was hard, especially thinking about Save the Cat, is she essentially is trying to say that it should all be negative, 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 negative until the end. Whereas Save the Cat says you can have the false victory, right? Where it's you are getting victories, but you're still doing it the wrong way. So at some point you're going to have to realize that this was not right. But it doesn't seem like that's what she's saying. She's saying
She says that, but then she publishes this graph. Up down.
Yeah.
So, like, is that which one are you picking? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think that by having an up and down, by having some good moments, it keeps you going because, like, especially if you like, you're like, oh, this won't last. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it keeps you wanting to.
Yeah,
know.
I feel like I was trying to think because I write contemporary, so she's talking about fantasy, which I know is different, but I'm trying to apply it, what she's saying to what I'm writing, and that's why I'm wondering if it's just something that's different for fantasy because I feel like in contemporaries you don't have that. You have some chapters where things are just good. It's like a false good, like, oh, we have this one moment or this scene where things go really well and it's all about to fall out in the next one, like where you have that up and down. And so I'm just curious because I don't read as much fantasy. Like, would you say that this, like, do you have scenes like that in fantasy where it's not getting worse in every scene?
My thing is like, I have depression, so I'm already sad.
I feel you, girl.
I hear that.
And I'm gonna bail on a book that is continuously more and more worse.
Yeah.
Every if I am happy through the book and nothing good has happened, I'm not gonna keep reading it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
so.
Well, okay, so like Lizelle said that she thinks it's more applicable. I cannot say that word. I'm sorry. To adult fantasy, a lot of popular adult fantasy things get worse. The character constantly. I think it still depends because in adult fantasy there is like grimdark. Grimdark is just stuff getting worse and worse and worse. And so I think it depends, like Hilla just said, like it depends on the fantasy. That there are some where things do, like grimdark fantasies often are just getting worse and worse and worse and don't get better. I think it just depends on the book.
Phoebe, what about the obligated YA fantasy scene where there's a party and the protag wears a pretty dress?
I mean, there's always a fight or someone's bleeding by the end of the party, but yeah.
True, yeah. Well, that's what I was trying to say is she's trying to say that like some element is getting worse, but it could have positive things that are coming out of it. Like,
I mean,
I guess if you're thinking about it like that, I'm sorry, Kevin, before I forget this. I guess if you're thinking about it like that, if it's all like a false, like if you're doing things wrong, then like it looks like positive, but it's only going to make them deeper in the wrong. So maybe it is getting worse in that way, even though a bad thing didn't happen. They're getting farther and farther away from what the way they need to go to get that character growth. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, like, for instance, like in this series, there's a girl, like the love interest, and he's like fighting with her. And then at the end of one chapter, they like make up and she's like, oh, she still does love me. But the implication behind that is because he is someone that's like high profile, that she now is in danger by being outwardly in love with him, if that makes sense. Like now that people know that like they're a thing, it brings danger to her. So like the idea is like it ends on a high note, like, oh, she does love me still. But like the implication is that there are still bad things that can, and everything else in his life is still crap. Like there's still stuff happening. So it's like a glimpse of hope, but like if you really think about it, it's hope on surface level.
Yeah, because I feel like, I guess, like I'm thinking like, because in Save the Cat where she talks about like you're doing things wrong, or maybe it's in one of the other books, but like they're doing things the wrong way, and it's not till later they have to refigure out the right way to solve it. And so I feel like if you're having a good thing happen but doing it the wrong way, it is making it worse for you because now you're deeper into the wrong way. Yeah. Because that has validated the wrong way. But I guess it just wasn't how I read it in this. She made it seem very literal.
Yeah, I agree.
Lizelle has a really good explanation in the chat.
Okay, let's see.
Overall,
so I feel like the graph is most descriptive. Like overall, it's getting worse, even though they're having highs within it. Like in the Hunger Games, she has cute moments with PETA. But it's the Hunger Games and like people are dying and they're getting closer to being in danger. Yeah, that's kind of, I think that's a good...
Again, it's because Deborah just kind of skimmed the surface without going in depth.
But I also am just thinking like,
old Debbie.
Her words are every scene should end with the character being in a worse situation, or things are worse for them. So I guess I don't know.
What are you doing?
I just
Maybe I'm taking it too literal.
I was gonna say, I think that she writes it to be too literal. Like, she's not going in depth to really think about it. She's just saying, like,
Yeah.
this is a situation. It's like, okay, but that has a little nuance to it. You know, like, what is a worse situation? What is, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be so outwardly a worse situation.
Yeah.
At least in my, I don't know. I think that, again, it was just her lack of not going in depth to talk about a subject.
Yeah. It felt very conversational, the book did.
Yeah. Lizelle says she's expressed herself poorly in the text. I agree.
Yeah.
I think that
She's not very good at writing her feelings.
I think she had good ideas, but was not good at explaining those ideas.
Well, that's why I said, like, she was giving tips and not process or craft. This was writing tips and not craft. That's my...
I want to know about the process.
Yeah. How do I get there? How do I do this myself? Not like...
How
Like, okay, then tell me how to do it the right way.
How do I get my brain to write in a whole other universe with other creatures and characters and different species and monsters and magic systems and
you're asking
33 viewpoints?
You're asking too much of Deborah.
Yeah, I know we're expecting too much.
I think that...
Dang it, Debbie.
I mean, overall, though, I didn't dislike the book. I might come across like I disliked it. I did not dislike it. I think she had some good points, and I think that she had some good tips, but I think that it really depends on how you're going into this. Like, I don't think you should go into this expecting to be able to write a fantasy after reading it, to be honest.
I mean, I think that's kind of where my disappointment came, was that I am someone who is very intimidated by writing fantasy and was hoping that by reading this, I would feel more comfortable writing fantasy, and I do not feel that way.
I don't think that you'll come out of this feeling better about writing fantasy. I think that it'll give you tips and jumping points to then research other places.
Yeah.
I gave this 3 stars on Goodreads because I feel like this book has an audience, but that audience is not me.
Yeah.
Agree.
Actually, we're probably
like if I was rating it based off of how I feel about it, it'd be like maybe a 1. But I feel like it could be useful for some people. So
I'll probably give it a 3 as well for the same reasons. Is that, like, I think that this is probably useful to some people, but again, just do not read this.
Also, is this a glossary at the back of this? No, it's an index.
I thought the same thing when I saw it. I was like, this girl did not just crap on glossaries and include one.
I was about to throw it across the room. It was
but
about to happen.
But it also makes me want to go through all 40 of her books and be like, really? You've written 40 fantasy books and not one of them has a glossary? I find that hard to believe.
Give me all the glossaries.
I love them. Here's the thing. Is it on Scribd? If it's on Scribd and you can just listen to it, sure.
Yeah.
It is on Scribd, but only the physical ebook.
Well,
that's what it's called.
Even then, okay, go ahead and read it. But like, would I say go out of your way to spend? Because this wasn't this like $16, $18? Get it from the library. Get it from the library. Read it on ebook for free.
I would say someone who is new to writing and is particularly interested in fantasy, I would recommend this as a first craft.
Yeah.
So if you're newer, you haven't read a lot of craft books and you're newer to writing and you know for a fact that you're mainly going to write fantasy, then I think it is helpful to think about in terms of fantasy, the examples that she gives. And it's a jumping off point. But then whatever you find useful or you want more development from, then I suggest seeking out books that are talking about those particular aspects. But there is some good, like, I would just say, like, general tips in here that I just think are helpful. I just think, that's why I would do it as well. I don't know that I learned a lot of craft, but they were just little one-off tips that I was like, okay, like that, like the way she put that is helpful, or, oh, I didn't realize that, or I didn't know that, and like like I said, I didn't know anything about this idea of like scenes and sequels and stuff like that. So it's something I want to look into further. So I felt like that was helpful.
Yeah. Gila, I actually like Snatterson better than Sanderson, so I'm gonna start calling him Snatterson. But here's the thing. People are saying it's overpriced. Here's the thing. This is actually kind of middle of the road for some of the other craft books we've done. James N. Frey's was like $30.
It wasn't that much, but
it was $28 on Amazon. That's why I didn't buy it.
That's not how much I paid for it.
Well, it was $28 on Amazon when I looked. That's why I read the.
I think I paid like $23 for it.
That's insane.
I am a broke ass white bitch. I ain't got that kind of money, Laura.
Brando Sando.
I've seen your book hauls, Jessica.
So like it was.
I got that kind of money to waste.
So this is like kind of middle of the road price wise, but the reason why it is a little bit more expensive is because it is a small press. Ooh. So the small presses. So like I do think we should support small presses, but like for this one,
Yeah.
get it from your library. Request it at your library because then your library can buy it and you can just, you know.
I'm now taking out all of my pretty paper clips and putting in regular flags.
I again, just like overall feelings is that it's a jumping point rather than that.
I personally, as someone who has never written anything fantasy, did not feel like it would help me write a fantasy.
I think it's again the jumping off point for writing in general.
Yes.
With examples that are applied to fantasy.
I personally, as someone who has only ever written fantasy, do not feel like it's going to help you write a fantasy.
And as someone who's written both, I again don't think it's going to help you write fantasy.
But if you're someone who's new to craft and you know you're going to write fantasy, why not read this as an intro book? Because it does use fantasy as all of the examples, which I do think is helpful. And some of her tips are specific to fantasy. Like she's talking about multi-POVs and when you should do that and certain scene aspects. And
there's multiple point of view in contemporary.
Okay, but I feel like the way that she's like you would never have a contemporary that has like 6 points of view.
Sure you do.
I can think of one.
Mystery novels that have.
Yeah, but that's not. I'm talking about a YA contemporary. That's a mystery.
I can think of one YA contemporary, and it was the Swoon Reads book. And one of the points of view,
and I read it, and it was not very good.
And like one of the points of view is like a bench, I think, and one's like a squirrel.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a love story. One of Us is Lying.
Okay, well, One of Us is Lying is a thriller, and it also did not have 6 points of view.
Do you think John Truby's?
I'm talking about like contemporary YA.
Stacy wants to know if you think John Truby's book was better.
That's a good question, Stacy.
Truby was really condescending.
Listen, if this woman had her way, we would never have the 5th season because you're not allowed to have a second point of view.
Here's what I'll say about this book in comparison to John Truby. John Truby was very dense, very hard to understand, very hard to follow, very condescending. This is too simple. So I feel like they're very different books. And I think they're on the same level of helpfulness.
I think this was easier to read.
This one 100%. This would 100% be like if my brother, like one of my other brothers, not Kevin, who aren't really like writers and haven't been studying it for a long time, was like, look, I'm thinking about writing a book, but I don't really know the first thing about it. I would recommend this over John Truby.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Fair enough.
So take that as, you know.
Honestly, not to be a Save the Cat Writes a Novel fanboy, but it's still my favorite one. I still think it does the best out of any of these books.
To me, it is the same as Story Genius.
I don't think is that the one I haven't read yet?
No, that's one I keep begging you
to read. I own it, though. I do own it.
So. I keep begging you to read it. So to me, they're just doing different things. So
I've been reading one by K.M. Wayland, and I'm only like on chapter 2, but I'm really enjoying that as well. But I don't remember what it's called, so I'm not being very helpful right now.
I need to read the one that Luzelle suggested about writing faster.
I did buy that one. I just haven't read it yet because I'm not writing right now.
Literally on my Kanban board, it says "Read K.M. Wayland's book." I don't know.
You didn't even put the title there.
I don't even have the title on there. It's fine.
Yeah. So yeah. Any last thoughts on this book, you guys?
Well, apparently,
that's a pretty cover.
One of my posties fell out, and I don't know where it goes now.
If you look really closely, I didn't realize till today there are people in the fog.
What?
Oh yeah,
that's creepy.
I will say, as far as the book club goes, we are only going to be doing one more book this year for September, and then we're gonna go on hiatus till January because there's Preptober, then there's NaNoWriMo and the holidays and stuff. So lots of things going on. But we do already have the book chosen for next month, and I will announce it on my channel later this week. So if you are not already subscribed to me, what the heck are you waiting for? I'm cute and fun.
Jessica,
Jessica and Kevin, subscribe to all of us.
because Stacy said it's Outlining Your Novel by K.M. Wayland.
That's another thing I would say about this. If you are a pantser, I feel like no craft books are really for you because
I really don't. I agree.
I feel like inherently though a craft book is meaning you're going to be putting thought into it beforehand. So, although not necessarily, I guess you could craft it after you pants the draft. You know.
Well, she said something about pantsing that I feel like was a little dismissive of pantsing, which I feel like so many of them are. I
mean, I'm not. But the thing is, I don't disagree. So.
One of them in particular said that like you can't write a good novel if it's pantsed.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So yeah.
Excessive.
Definitely, like I said, we already have the book chosen for September, but I'm always looking for suggestions for next year. So if you have any craft ones, send them my way. Also, you can suggest them to the book club Instagram. All that information is in the description. I think we might already have the one for January picked out, but
do we?
FYI,
but
it's structuring your novel.
Structuring your novel, nice.
Oh, that's not outlining it. Okay, well then.
I think she has two. I don't know if the other one is outlining your novel or if it's something completely different. But yeah.
I'm currently reading I'm reading Hooked, which is a craft book on the beginning of books. So I will be doing a review of that on my channel, but it's not one we're going to do for the book club. So, yeah. So I don't know. Again, not the worst, not the best.
Middle of the road.
Yeah.
Middle of the road and very specific. I will have, after I've been able to formulate all my thoughts, a review of this eventually. I haven't even reviewed the last one yet because I haven't posted a video in 2 weeks, y'all. So I'm going to try this week to get some stuff. I'm at least going to have the video up that announces the last book for the year. But I've just been in,
Listen, I missed my own live stream of the book chat for my own book club. So
life happens, So, but thank you guys.
I had to make my own, another one.
It happens, Jessica. But I did appreciate you joining us, Jessica, today as our resident fantasy writer.
Anytime.
And thank you guys so much for joining in the chat, and I hope that you will stick around on my channel for later this week to hear the last book choice for the year and join us next time as well. The next book, I'll tell you right now, is half the length of this one.
Very short.
Good, I'll read that one.
Very, very short.
And it comes highly suggested. So, yeah. But thank you guys. As always, gives me a lot to think about, and I can't wait to do this again. And if you have not already subscribed to Kevin and Jessica, what are you waiting for? They're fantastic. They're even cooler than I am. Oh, Laura's being nice today to Kevin. Let's record that.
Is it just because both of your siblings are here and we'll beat you up?
Yes. You guys are gang up on me.
Oh, doing that face just gave me a headache.
I'll do reviews on any craft books that I read, so definitely recommend things. I am here for it. So. All right, guys. Thank you, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Bye.